Hello, my name is Forough. I'm a graduate student in the Health Informatics program at George Mason University. Today I'll be going over a case study that I worked on to assess the quality performance of MedStar National Rehabilitation Hospital located in Washington, D.C. The analysis will focus on patients who are assumed to have suffered from a stroke. For this analysis, data was obtained from the CMS Hospital Compare website. Care Compare enables patients and caregivers to make informed decisions about healthcare based on cost, quality of care, volume of services, and other data. The first limitation is the lack of data. Despite having the many data sets shown on the previous slide, not all of them included measures that I was looking for. Care Compare information about IRFs is typically updated or refreshed quarterly in March, June, September, and December. However, the refresh schedule is subject to change and not all measure data will be updated during each quarterly release. The second point that I want to consider as a limitation is the COVID-19 pandemic, because it resulted in some changes to reporting requirements and most likely to care as well. During the time frame beginning in October 2019 until June 30th, 2020, CMS made it optional and temporarily excused providers from the submission of assessment data. What I noticed was that CMS was releasing what looked like new data, but it was really a frozen data set from the previous release. This happened for two data sets, the July 2021 and the September 2021 release. These data sets were a duplicate of the December 2020 release. The last limitation that I want to talk about is that because MNRH is a standalone facility, I should ideally compare the results of the data to other local standalone rehabilitation facilities. My chosen competitors that I'll be going over on the next slide are actually units within bigger hospitals, so it's not exactly going to be a perfect comparison due to this difference in the facility structures. As I mentioned, I will be comparing performance, and to compare the performance of MNRH for patients who suffered a stroke, I'll use data from the following three facilities: the George Washington University Hospital, Inova Rehab Center at Inova Mount Vernon, and finally Reston Hospital Inpatient Rehabilitation Center. On the screen, I've listed the quality measures that I looked into to analyze performance. Before presenting the results, I'd like to mention that the Tukey method was used to generate the charts. This method analyzes data based on the calculation of the confidence interval for medians. The procedure has several advantages. First, it does not assume any distribution of the data. Secondly, it is not affected by unusual data points or outliers. And last, it can be applied to small data sets. The first measure is the facility observed rate of patients who experienced changes in skin integrity post-acute care or pressure, ulcers, and injuries. CMS made data for this measure publicly available starting in late 2020. According to the Tukey control chart, we can see that the variations in the observed rates are similar to historical patterns. In other words, nothing unusual happened during the time periods. The second measure is the rate of catheter-associated urinary tract infections. Fortunately, there was plenty of data for this measure. However, the data was only reported for MedStar and Inova Rehab at Mount Vernon. I was unable to find data from CMS on the additional two health centers for this measure. And according to this chart, the data was within control limits during the data collection period of April 2016 to March 2017, and up until October 2018 to September 2019. And then the last time period of April 2019 to September 2020, it shows that the measure went outside of the control limits. The third measure is the percent of patients whose functional abilities were assessed and goals were included in the treatment plan. Here, it looks like MNRH was within the control limits during the time periods. The fourth quality measure is the percent of patients who are at or above an expected ability to care for themselves at discharge. CMS also made data for this measure publicly available only starting in December 2020. All observed data for the 2 reporting time periods indicate that the data was within control limits. Of course, having data points for only 2 time periods is not very insightful. The last quality measure that I analyzed was percent of patients who are at or above an expected ability to move around at discharge. And for this measure also, CMS did not publish data until December 2020. And like the previous slide, the data for the 2 reporting periods are again within control limits. And once again, the control limits are not extremely useful as I'm working with a tiny data set. And now I will go ahead and briefly summarize my findings. For quality measures 1, 3, 4, and 5, MNRH's results were within the control limits, indicating no deviation from the standard or historical patterns for those particular measures. For measure 2, due to the results for the reporting period beginning in April 2019 and ending in September 2020 being outside of the upper control limits, we can say that the measure is unstable or out of control. Steps could be put in place to bring the measure back down to within the upper control and lower control limits. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you for taking the time to review my work.